take your seat, just look at your neighbor and say, freedom is what God does. My brothers and sisters, in an article written by the Nairobi Baptist Church, it was noted, and I quote, freedom is a word with a host of meanings. To many today, its most relevant significance is in the sense of economic and political liberation from oppressive systems. There is no doubt that the quest of liberation movement is a topic of vital concern for Christians. It went on to say, Christians, and I quote, Christians have often neglected to participate in struggles for social justice because of an individualistic emphasis on personal salvation. In other words, Christians have reduced freedom to an individual pursuit of personal gain at the expense of communal advancement. The tragic misinterpretation of God's involvement in the lives of oppressed people has caused those in positions of advantage and power to further alienate and restrict freedom from those in need. Now, on tomorrow, we recognize Independence Day. But the ironic thing is, as a nation, we have yet to fully achieve independence. It needs mentioning right through here that slavery lasted 246 years, from 1619 to 1865. And July 4th, 2022 marks 246 years as a free, independent nation. The nation has been free as long as slaves have been free. But yet, there's inequality in freedom. The Declaration of Independence was approved by the Constitutional Congress on July 4, 1776. And as this nation celebrates 246 years of quote-unquote freedom, we see some desperate, misinformed, and theologically confused Christians trying to turn back the hands of time. There are some who have a Pharaoh mentality that's driving their decisions simply because they are afraid. Afraid of what they may lose. Afraid of giving up power. Afraid of having to share economically, politically, judicially, and relationally. Afraid of no longer being the majority. Their fears have motivated them to do whatever they feel necessary to hold on to power. Now, this is nothing new, because power and control has always been the fascination of those who are in power. Some Christians have adopted a false ideology that seeks personal gain at the expense of others. And this Pharaoh mentality is what God destroyed when God delivered God's people out of bondage. This Pharaoh mentality is found in Exodus chapter 1. You've got to go back 11 chapters, verses 8 through 14. Where the text says, eventually a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to the people, this new king, look, the people of Israel, and if I could contextualize it truthfully for you, he said, look, those people of color now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us. They will escape from the country. He goes on to say, so the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses as supply centers for the king. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread. And the more alarmed the Egyptians became. It goes on to conclude by saying, so the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the fields. They were ruthless in their demands. Pharaoh was ruthless in his treatment to non-Egyptians who were living in Egypt. He was ruthless in his treatment, similar to a Supreme Court that's bent on advancing, advocating, and validating further oppression. He was ruthless in his treatment, similar to those 8 Akron police officers who unloaded 60 rounds into the body of Jalen Walker over an alleged traffic violation. Y'all not talking to me. He was ruthless in his treatment, similar to that systematic coup attempt to overthrow the government because somebody did not want to leave their place of power. He was ruthless. I'm talking about Pharaoh, ruthless in his treatment, similar to the governor of Virginia's deceitful tactic of overturning the early release opportunity of over 500 inmates scheduled for early release. You know what I'm saying? He was ruthless in his treatment, and this mentality is still pervasive today, and tragically is often perpetuated by folk who call themselves Christians. Evangelicals who believe that a young girl should be forced to carry the baby of a rapist or her pedophiliac father. Y'all not saying that. Pharaoh was ruthless. But here's the good news. God had something to say. See, God systematically put in place plagues and demonstrations of his power as a way to show Pharaoh who really has absolute power. Not only that, God's demonstrations of power would also reinforce for God's people and reinforce for Pharaoh, here it is, the depth of God's disdain for oppressive behavior against those who are unable to defend for themselves. Pharaoh believed that his hand was the hand of power. But God had to break him off a little something, just to remind him this is what God did. And can I talk about it for a minute? Then we have to immediately go home. The first thing the text teaches us today and what God does is, the first thing God does is God intervenes demonstratively. Now, in order to fully understand chapter 12, you got to go back 7 through 10. Because in chapter 7 through 10, God unleashed plague after plague after plague after plague that left Pharaoh mystified over the power of Moses, his God. Help me somebody. After a series of plagues, Pharaoh believed he could hold God off. But what he did not realize was God had not yet finished. And that's a good spot to remind every system that's trying to attack you and deny you, God ain't finished yet. Amen. See, Pharaoh believed his oppressive tactics would ultimately prevail over Almighty God. And then you get to chapter number 11, when Pharaoh may have thought all was well, when Pharaoh may have thought I outlasted God, when Pharaoh may have thought I outdistanced God, when Pharaoh may have thought God ain't gonna bother me no more. The text says in chapter 11, verse 1, then the Lord said to Moses, I ain't forgot Pharaoh. I will strike Pharaoh in the land of Egypt with one more blow. Somebody holler one more blow right now. After that one more blow, Pharaoh will let you leave this country. In fact, he will be so quick to let you go, he will tell you leave with everything you got. Look, God was about to deliver the fatal blow. And God's action against Pharaoh should remind every oppressive force that God will deliver a blow that you will not be able to recover from. Y'all not talking to me today. See, from God's perspective, can I talk about it for a minute? From God's perspective, the God of Old Testament truth does not view freedom as some cultural privilege for some. But freedom is for all suffering under the oppressive conditions and the yoke of the oppressor. And until freedom is achieved, God will always be engaged in the lives of those people who are living on the fringes and those who are living under the weight of oppression. Somebody holler, thank you, Jesus. God confronted Pharaoh's oppressive system. And then you get to chapter number 12. And in chapter number 12, after chapter number 11, and God tells Moses, I got one more blow in hand, Moses, so y'all get ready. In chapter 12, he prepares the people to leave. Y'all don't even know what I'm hollering. He prepares the folk to get ready to come out. I'm going to say it one more time for somebody. demonstratively. And what else God does is something exciting for me this morning, because not only does God intervene demonstratively, but God executes strategically. Y'all do have to understand that God is a God of strategy. Okay. I'm going to take you back to verse 29. It says, at that night, at midnight, if you got your Bible, underline that word midnight, because that's important. The Lord struck down all the firstborn sons in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn son of the prisoner in the dungeon. Even the firstborn of their livestock were killed. After God declares his intention to Moses, when you get to verse 31 and 32, Pharaoh summons Moses. Hey, Moses, y'all come here. Get out. That's what the Bible says. Leave my people and take the rest of them folk with you. Go and worship the Lord as you have requested. And look, don't leave nothing back. Take your flocks and your herds and be gone. In other words, I don't want to see a reminder that you was ever here. Okay. I told you around midnight, right? It was during the night, that Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. Okay. God's strategic execution occurred during the time when Pharaoh was in least control, and when Pharaoh was most subject to the powers of chaos. Where is Cassidy Hutchinson when you need him? God comes out. At a time when Pharaoh had no control, God sent his last blow. At the time when Pharaoh was most vulnerable, God executed his plan for the release of God's people. God executed strategically in the release of his people. And that's a good spot to remind those continuing in their oppressive actions that God has a way of defying all logic. And just when you think you are scot-free, God will drop the hammer and set us free. Look, Pharaoh was now at the mercy of God. Woo! Can I holler for a minute? Because it just tells me that at some point in time, all them folk who are oppressing people are going to be at the mercy of Almighty God. It might not happen today, it might not happen next week, but sure as I'm standing here, God is not a man that God should lie. If God said it, God is going to do it. Pharaoh wanted to be Lord and master over a group of people. But Pharaoh had to learn the hard way. You can't be Lord over nothing you ain't created. You can't be master over nothing that you didn't make. God help us today. Pharaoh is now forced to face a newfound reality. And here it is, that the power of God has been executed directly towards him. Now that's important, because the plagues, prior to the last plague, the plagues did not affect Pharaoh directly. But the last one had his name on it. And when it knocked at his door, he said, yo, somebody go get Moses and somebody go get Aaron, so come in. Y'all need to get up out of here. Because y'all causing me more problems than I could have anticipated. Listen to what he said. Get out. Leave. Go. And worship. The words that Pharaoh did not want to utter in the beginning were the words that Pharaoh said when it was all over. You do realize God will make you do what you don't want to do. God has a way of making you do the very thing you said you would never do. He said, I'm not going to let y'all go. I'm going to work y'all till I can't work y'all no more. And the more he worked them, the more they multiplied. The harder it came, the better they were. And then he said, I'm not going to let you go, because if I let you go, you will go to my enemies and you will fight against me. But God flipped that thing so that at the very end, he said, y'all got to get up out of here. Just how far you ready that God will have the last say. Look, for all the folks who listen to me today, and you believe that you can resist God to the point to where God is going to back up off you, I hate to be the one to tell you, but God can make you do what you refuse. Okay, I'm going to help all y'all. Y'all are looking at me like, Kenney talking to me. A whole lot, all of us said, I ain't ever going to give my life to God. I ain't going to church no more. Bump your neighbor and say, look at you now. Don't ever say what you won't do, because God has a way of making you do the very thing you say you won't do. Look, Pharaoh had no choice but to let them go. Because Pharaoh came to the realization, James, that he was no match for God. And you have to be arrogantly ignorant to believe that you can stand up to the Creator of all heaven and earth. You've got to be so delusional in your thinking to believe that you can stand up to God. You have got to be senile to believe that you can reverse the laws of God to where God won't have God's final say in the life of God's creation. Something must be, I ain't the sharpest pencil in the box, but I do realize this. God will always have the last say over what God wants to see done in the lives of creation. And that's good news today. Because no political party aimed at restricting freedom can contend with God. No systems of oppression can contend with God. No self-constructed system of servitude can contend with God. No empire can contend with God. And no devil in hell can contend with our God. Pharaoh faces the ultimate display of God's power in a direct and personal way. And he finally succumbs to the power of God. He said, y'all got to get up out of here. Contrary to his previous stand. But listen, it gets better. It gets better. Here it is, Mr. Weaver. He said, before y'all leave, y'all bless me. Get it in your mind. Here are oppressed people who didn't have nothing. Pharaoh, who is the image of the blessor. The blessings in Egypt resided with Pharaoh. Pharaoh said, before y'all leave, bless me. Somebody say, oh, that don't make sense. An astonishing reversal of fortune. Because by all appearances in the storyline, Pharaoh carried the blessing. In Egypt, Pharaoh was the one who was perceived to have the blessing. But what does God do? God makes the last first. And the first last. God oppressed people. We're now the ones, God help me, Reverend Frank, on my heart. God oppressed people. We're now the ones being sought out for a blessing. Okay, I'll say it again real slow. Y'all listen. The ones who did not look like they had anything to offer were now being sought out. For that's why you should never let nobody determine your status when it comes to your relationship with God. God has a way of confounding the wise. God has a way of making you look so good in the eyes of others, and you know I ain't got but two nickels to rub together, but they be looking for you to put a blessing on their life. Not because you got something tangible, but because they realize you have a God who is able to do all things but faith. band of slaves who sinned to possess nothing. Pharaoh wanted them gone out of it because Pharaoh believed and he realized he no longer could stand up against God. And the longer he stood up against Moses and God, the more likelihood he was going to face more death and trouble. He wanted them gone because he realized that God being against him was not something he could stand up against. And for all those people who believe that they can stand up against God, my grandma told me a long time ago, your arms are too short to box with God. Pharaoh wanted them out, and so did God. Say it again, preacher. Pharaoh wanted them out, and so did God. Say it one more time. They listen. Pharaoh wanted them out, and so did God. And because God wanted them out, God brought them out. Somebody be happy right there. Because when God wants to do something in your life, there ain't nothing that can stand in your way from keeping God from doing what God desires to do. What the storyline teaches us today is that oppression is not God's will for humanity. Oppression is not God's desire for God's creation. God will always fight for the underdog because that's what God does. The text reminds us today that God relentlessly values what brutalizing powers devalue. The text reminds us today that a completely powerless people have the power to transform their situation. This text reminds us today that when God gets involved in the lives of all the oppressed, when God intervenes demonstratively, and when God executes strategically, things will turn out the way God wants them to turn out. I don't know who I'm preaching to now, but somebody in here today ought to get real happy before Monday ever show up. Because no matter what the government might do, no matter what the government might say, no matter what the politicians might do, no matter what they might not do, you stand in the liberty of the risen Christ who has made you free. This text reminds us that when God gets involved in the lives of all the oppressed, worldly powers and all the grandeur that surrounds them end up becoming nothing but shells of powerlessness. It's what God does. You want to shake your neighbor and tell your neighbor, I got a God who's standing on my side. I got a God who's executing will. I got a God who's on my left. What God does, God will always intervene. And when God intervenes, He not be in me. Because God executes freedom in the lives of his people. And the news ain't looking good right now. The news ain't looking good at all right now. But you got to remind yourself that I know how the story ends. I know how the story ends. John said, I saw him high. Lift up your head, O ye gates, that the King of glory shall come. Who is the King of glory? The Lord God is strong and mighty. Mighty in battle. For God has not given me the spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind. Take me to where you laid him. For he's been dead, Jesus, for quite some time. That don't matter to me. Take me to where you laid him. Lazarus, come forth. Death can't hold me. When God gets ready to execute liberty in your life. Hey! Glory to God. Freedom is what God does.